All right, all right.
Professor Massimo Ramaioli.
Very nice.
Pronounce your last name perfectly for me.
Yeah, it's not an easy catch. It's Ramaioli.
Ramaioli.
That's awesome. An Italian.
An Italian professor who has a James Bond kind of life. We'll talk about that. Welcome to our seminar. Thank you so much for coming in. We are speaking to you today, not from Rome, not from Venice, and not from Sicily, but from what city?
So I'm speaking from Karachi, which is the largest city in Pakistan, one of the largest cities in Asia, matter of fact, where I've been living for the past 3 years now. Yeah.
Okay, great. We're going to talk all about that. So this is week number 2 of our seminar. We're talking about understanding the Middle East, right? And the Arab and the Muslim world generally. When American or Western diplomats, folks from the State Department, maybe from the Department of Defense, are sent to the Middle East, right? They often don't know much about it, and there are many misconceptions, right? So even if you go through diplomatic training, understanding the nuance of Middle Eastern geopolitics can be tricky, as we learned over the last couple of decades. Let's talk about some of the key misconceptions relating to the Middle East.
Right. So there are a number, Guy, of misconceptions. If I were to start with the most important ones, at least in my view, is to ignore the history of the region. Like, you cannot get a sense of what the Middle East is now if you ignore the history that has brought us here, so to speak. So it doesn't mean that you have to get a PhD in Middle Eastern history, not at all, right? But you have always to be very cognizant, very aware that there is a reason why, there is an historical process by which things that we see nowadays have been given birth. Let me give you a very quick example. I'm sure that all of your students have a good understanding that things between the US and Iran are not great, right? There are two countries that have been feuding for X amount of years now. So we know that. That's something that goes on now, right? But if I were to ask your students, who's Mohammad Mossadegh? Most people wouldn't know about him, right? Mossadegh was the prime minister of Iran in 1953. And there's a history that happened in 1953 between the US and Mossadegh that gave us the current predicament between these two countries, right? So it's hard to understand what goes on now between the US and Iran unless you have a sense, at least, of the 20th century history between Iran and the United States. So first of all, learn, get familiar, get literate in the history of the region.
Well, let me interrupt you over here. So we're talking about the history. Folks in the Middle East have a long sense of history, right? So when ISIS or even Al Qaeda, came to power, they were referring to American troops or the Western coalition as crusaders. I mean, we're talking about a long sense of history. How far do people need to go back? Do people need to go back to the birth of Islam, to the spread of Islam? Are we talking about colonialism with the Ottoman Empire, the Persians? How far are we going?
Look, as I said, you don't need to become an expert, for example, on the early days of Islam or about the Abbasid Empire or an expert about the Ottoman Empire, right? That's a little too much for us to ask, even though there is no harm in studying those things, right? Mm-hmm. My suggestion would be be cognizant that those things have happened, be able to locate them chronologically, and be sure to understand that these people care about history and have a different sense about history than America. And look, we don't need to even go to the Middle East. As an Italian, I go around and I see things that have been there for like 3,000 years. Oh, another Roman ruins, okay? There is a sense of history in the Middle East, in Europe, that is different from what you have in America. And people really care. People really have a different understanding of how far back history goes, right? You mentioned, two very important periods in history that we should be cognizant of at all times. The Crusades, for example, was this major clash between the Christian world back then, Christendom in medieval Europe, and Arab Muslim empires in the Middle East. That happened 800 years ago. And then colonialism, which is, of course, much more recent and much more vivid in the memories of people in the Middle East. Some people are old enough to remember when, you know, Jordan or Syria were either under the Brits or the French, right? An old guy in Damascus may remember when the French were there, right? So it's something that has really permeated the current understanding of politics in this neck of the woods. So if you ignore history, particularly if you ignore colonialism, then it's going to be tough to understand what goes on nowadays. Again, I live in a country like Pakistan that has to deal constantly with the legacy of British colonialism. Matter of fact, I use English in my university. Why? Well, because the Brits were here, not because English was a local native language of Pakistan, right? So we need to be cognizant of that fact.
Okay, so history is number one. What else?
Number two would be to, how can I say, assume that they should be like us, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
We have a certain way of doing things, we have a certain way of thinking, a certain way of, you know, addressing issues and solving issues. Why can't they just do like we do? Well, you can easily flip it around and ask, why shouldn't we adapt to their ways of doing things, right? We have to understand that, you know, different histories brings different cultures, different ways of living, and different ways of dealing with issues, different solutions, different values, right? And we should be humble enough to recognize that there are different ways to do things, that our way may not be necessarily the best way. Maybe it's the best way for us, not necessarily for other people. And we have to be, in my view, humble enough and open-minded enough to understand that our way is not the only way, and other ways are just as legitimate, just as possible, or just different. And it requires a little bit of a mental stretching, so to speak.
So a little bit of cultural relativism in your case, because let me push back on you and argue or present the argument, right?
Right.
That there are some Western liberal values, such as freedom, right, equality, that are better values than dictatorship and suppression of minorities, right? So how would you answer that criticism?
Oh, absolutely. It's not that people here don't like freedom. You're never gonna, I mean, you may find sometimes the guy who really loves Saddam Hussein, right? Yeah, there are people like that around. But for the most part, these people like freedom. They love the possibility to practice their religion freely. They would like to have a say in what the government does or does not do for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, however, their way to understand freedom is not exactly the same kind of articulation that we have in the West. It's a little bit different. For example, individualism is not as important in the Middle East as it is in the West, particularly in America. There is a deeper sense of belonging to a community, be that your family, your tribe, your clan, your religious community, what have you. That's different a little bit, but that's not necessarily worse than a sense of heightened self, so to speak. There are definitely values such as freedom of press, freedom of opinion, freedom of congregation and gathering, freedom of association. These things, at least in my view, have been sought after by Muslim people just as they are in the West. There are, however, some differences. For example, a heightened sense of community here that must be taken into account.
Okay, very good, very important. All right, so we spoke about history. We talked about differences in values and culture. What else? Anything else we should think about?
Yeah, and do not think in terms of black and white. It is dangerous because it gives you this simplified version of the simplified picture of the world, right? Where we are here and they are there. Mm-hmm. And it is a view that does not allow you to capture all the nuances, the details, the incredible diversity of the Middle East itself. I've been living, now 3 years in Pakistan. Before that, I spent 3 years in other countries. It was in Syria, it was in Jordan. And to be honest with you guys, the moment I could hang out with people from my same social class, for lack of better words, people that had studied, that were educated, that, you know, spoke English, the communality of vision, the things we shared was way, way, way more than what we had in, you know, than what separated us. I have wonderful friends in Jordan that are Jordanians and Arabs through and through. And yet I'm still in touch with them. It's very easy because there are many, many things we have in common. It means that it's not a black and white world, whereas there is the West and the non-West. It's much more nuanced. And with some Jordanians, I get along great. With some Jordanians, I don't get along at all. Just like with some Americans, I get along great. And with some Americans, I don't get along. And that works pretty much for every people on the planet, right? Yeah. So I would say steer clear from visions of this region that portray it in a monolithic fashion, so to speak.
Well, let's bring it back really to a couple of case studies, examples from recent history, right? Because the real challenge that American or Western politicians have is explaining their foreign policy in this area to their public, who often don't really know where Pakistan is, where, you know, Jordan is, where Syria is, and taking really complex situations, the politicians almost in a sense have to put it in terms of black and white, us and them. The dichotomous media frames, they allow them to articulate their foreign policy objectives, right? And it clashes so much with the really nuanced requirements that you're talking about.
It is not an easy issue to address. And let me be very clear, right? When I lived in Jordan, ISIS was on the rise, right? We heard, I actually landed in Amman, and news spread of this movement that was conquering pieces and bits of Iraq and Syria, and people in Jordan started freaking out. Who are these guys? Are we next, right? And of course, when you have to implement a foreign policy, you have to think about very nasty movements such as ISIS, which is not one of the movements we have to pay, I cannot say, particular respect to, or we have to understand. I mean, those people are incredibly nasty. And I understand that when you have to explain to the public why you go after ISIS, you have to be, you know, direct. You do not have time to engage so much in nuances. But you have to engage in nuances when it comes to say, ISIS does not represent the Arab world, does not represent Muslims. Matter of fact, all my Muslim friends in Jordan were freaked out by ISIS. They were terrified. And they were pious Muslim, you know, many women with the veil, you know, going to mosque every Friday. They saw ISIS just as a terrorist movement as I saw it as a non-Muslim, right? So what we can do is to say, you need to portray some things without nuance, and that's fine. ISIS and Al-Qaeda do not merit, do not deserve much of our, you know, compassion or respect, to say the least. But we can say they are not the representative of the Middle Eastern world, the Muslim world, or the Arab world at large. That much, I think, can be expected from our politicians, from our policymakers.
All right, well, let's go back to our diplomats in training watching this video, right? Yeah. And can we discuss I think one of the most difficult things for Westerners to really understand about the Middle East is the multiple layers of identity, right?
Oh boy, yes.
That in order to understand a nation, if we're talking about Pakistan, or if we're talking about, you know, pretty much anywhere in Northern Africa or the Middle East, right? So what are some of the different identity hats that an individual in the Middle East may wear? Can you speak about some of those?
Absolutely. And, you know, this is one of the key differences to me between our world, let's say the Western world, and the Middle East, right? Look, when I'm around and they ask me, where are you from? I'm like, I'm Italian, and that's pretty much it, right? I do not have particular other layers to my identity that my passport kind of tells, you know, people where I'm from in terms of my culture, values, you know, attitudes and stuff like that, right? And that speaks a lot to my self-understanding as an individual. And I would imagine that most Americans would be, you know, yeah, I'm from the US, I'm American, right? When it comes to the Middle East, it's a little bit different because you have a bunch of nation states that technically provides passport, just like Italy and the United States to their citizens, but they do not provide the same sense of identity that Italy, France, and the United States provide. A Jordanian lives in a state that has been created out of thin air by the Brits. There is no organic growth of a Jordanian state or Jordanian nation. So you have these people finding themselves in a state that was created by somebody else that didn't have a say in making these states. And then they start thinking, okay, why am I a Jordanian? Well, part of my identity is speaking Arabic. So I think that, speaking Arabic makes me Jordanian. And then you look around and everybody else in Syria, in Palestine, in Israel, in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, they all speak Arabic. And you're like, that doesn't make me different from any of the people living in other Arab countries. So am I a Jordanian or am I an Arab? Also, most Jordanians are also Muslims, like 90+%. And I'm speaking about Jordan because it's the country that I know quite well. This applies to any other country in the Middle East. So they also think, okay, I do not know exactly if I'm Jordanian or Arab, whatever that means, but also I am Muslim, and being Muslim is a very important part of my identity, right? It is important to me that, I have faith. I believe that Muhammad was the last prophet. I believe there is one God, and we refer to him as Allah, right? This is important to me. But is this more important than my national allegiance, than my loyalty to my linguistic group, the Arabs? I don't know. And it gets more complicated because then you may, I had my Arabic teacher actually, when I was living in Amman, constantly made reference to his belonging to a tribe, a group of people, he told me, that number between 2 to 3 million spread around Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and southern Lebanon. These were his people. He had cousins spread around all this region, and he would say, yeah, I belong to that clan, and that is part of my identity too. Now, the idea of a clan, of a tribe, to us Westerners is, something that makes us think about, I don't know, like medieval times or something like that. We don't have anymore that kind of identity layer, but it is present in the Middle East. And again, it's one of those things perhaps that I mentioned first, right? We shouldn't consider this good or bad. It's just part of the landscape. It's part of their identity. And as we said, I just mentioned, national identity, linguistic, cultural identity, religious identity, clan or tribe identity, and the list could go on and on and on. It's a very complex mosaic. Mm-hmm. And what we may want to be able to is to recognize how these different identities may play different political roles in different scenarios, right? So, for example, when a little bit about history, right? When Iraq was attacked or invaded, depending how you want to look at it, in 2003, a lot of the Arab people felt that another fellow Arab country was being attacked, right? So there was the cultural, linguistic aspect that was relevant. But the Iranians also felt, that a fellow Muslim country was being attacked, right? So there was this transnational set of identities. One that was cultural, linguistic, speaking the same language. One that was religion, belonging to the same religious community, Islam, that were activated by the same kind of major political, historical event, right?
Absolutely. And we didn't throw in sectarianism within religion, right? So we have the Sunni Shia divide, and within that, many different groups.
Yeah, that's another. It's fascinating. I mean, as a scholar, I read a little bit about this. It's fascinating, and of course, look, there are Sunni and Shia, right? Just like there are different denominations of Christianity in the West, right?
Protestantism and Catholicism is the easiest way to understand it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe. Every major religion has its own divisions, right? The major divisions within Islam, it's Sunni and Shia. I'm happy to go a little bit more into the details, but it's fundamentally a dispute about who was the legitimate heir to Prophet Muhammad when Prophet Muhammad, died.
Can you spend? I know this is one of your areas of research. Can you speak for maybe 2 or 3 minutes about the rift between Sunni and Shiites?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Muhammad was alive, right, he was the prophet, and he had a double role, so to speak. Again, for our ways of understanding things, a little complicated because it was at the same time the religious leader and the political leader of the community, right? So when he dies, we don't have just the fact that the last prophet is dead, right? His legacy is revelation in the Quran. That's the religious part of Muhammad, right? That's the easiest part to preserve and keep going with, right? We have a template, we have a Quran, we know what Islam is. But who takes his political duties, right? So his cousin and son-in-law, called Ali Taleb, says, look, I am the closest male kin relative to Muhammad. I'm the only one who has the blood of the house of the prophet running through my veins. You can imagine in a tribal society like that, 1400 years ago in Arabia, the closest male relative may have, pretty much a solid claim to receive the political legacy of Muhammad and say, I'm now the leader of the Islamic community. Other people instead said, actually, no, Muhammad didn't say that you had to be the one. Matter of fact, he created a very egalitarian democratic society where the elders of the society would decide who was going to take over the political reins of the community. So on the one hand, we have a blood-based claim to political leadership. And on the other hand, we have community-based claim to leadership. Now, the people who supported Ali's claim, the people who supported the cousin of the prophet claim, were called the partisans of Ali. Partisan in Arabic, it's Shia, right? So Shia Ali became the partisans of Ali. And the rest of the community who did not support Ali were called the followers of the practice of the prophet. Practice of the prophet in Arabic is Sunnah, the Sunnah of the prophet. So they were called Sunnis. Long story short, the Sunnis won out by, they won more battles than the Shia, basically. And they established themselves as the largest group within the Islamic world. So that nowadays between 80 to 85% of Muslims identify themselves as Sunnah. Whereas the smaller Shia represent between 10 to 15% of the Islamic world. And they are the ones who are like people who descended from the Prophet and then therefore descended from Ali are the ones we regard as the political leaders of our community. That's the historical reason behind the rift. That then, evolved in different religious, practices and whatever.
And hundreds of years later, this rift in politics within the world of Islam and the creation of the Sunni and the Shia movement are going to shape modern day geopolitics in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the entire region.
Yeah, it is important to understand that these two groups exist, right? Or these two large communities exist. And what we need to understand is under which circumstances, be a Shia or be a Sunni becomes important. Let me give you an example, right? In Europe nowadays, nobody cares if you're Catholic or Protestant. It's not that if I go to Germany, they're gonna check, oh, do you believe in the Pope? Are you one of those bloody Roman Catholics, right? Because we cannot stand them, right? Now, 300 years ago, that would have been the case. There was a bloody civil war in Europe, the 30 Years' War, in which Protestants and Catholics killed each other. We have to ask ourselves the same question. Why sectarian identities, Sunni and Shia, become what political science call salient identities? Why do they become relevant at some point in time and not in others? Because for many, many decades, sometimes centuries, Sunni and Shia are living side by side and they don't care. And all of a sudden, bam, you have these outbursts of violence that are terrible. They're completely and utterly terrifying. And we have also always to consider how other factors play into this Sunni-Shia rivalry. And other factors are socio-economic determinants, international relations factors, or, for example, let me give you this last anecdote, so to speak, about the Sunni and Shia. When I lived in Jordan, I met a young guy, a young fellow from Baghdad. He was a Sunni. His name was Laith, and he told me his story. He was from a very wealthy family, upper middle class, Sunni Baghdad. And one time in 2006, the leader of a Shiite militia comes to his father and says, "You guys have 24 hours to live, otherwise tomorrow you're gonna die." And basically they had to pack up everything, leave their house behind, and flee to Jordan. And he's yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes. So, and Leith told me, yes, they packed their belongings and they went to the safest place they could think of. They could reach by car. It's a 9-hour ride between Baghdad and Amman. And they've been living there ever since. I met him like 8 years after this event, right? And he was wondering as a teenager why that would happen, because he had plenty of Shiite friends, Shiite, neighbors, and never that came up. All of a sudden, the situations on the ground changed in order to make the Sunni-Shia rift actually a real life or death situation, right? And it is only, to say what? That it's not enough to say these people are Sunni, these people are Shia, therefore they're bound to hate each other. But it is to understand that that can become a real life or death issue under certain circumstances. And we should always be very cognizant of the complexity of those identity markers, so to speak, and how they can be activated in certain circumstances.
Wonderful. So let's wrap everything up. As people are introduced to the Middle East, they have to understand that this is a very complex place where identities are bound at different times. Different identities are going to be salient, and different interests will make some more salient than others for their own benefit. We have to understand that our Western values do not necessarily translate, perfectly to other parts of the world. And we have to assume that we have a lot to learn before we have a lot to teach. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would especially subscribe the last bit of yours, Guy. I think that's very important. I think absolutely. And if your student would like to study a little bit of the local languages, be Hebrew, Turkish, Persian, Arabic, Kurdish. I mean, these are fantastic languages to speak, right? And it makes a whole bunch of a difference if you can introduce yourself in the local language. If you are, if you can master that kind of skill, that would be something that that would go a long way in establishing better, more fruitful, more proficient relations.
Wonderful. Dr. Massimo Ramaioli, thank you very much for joining us today again from Karachi, Pakistan, and we really appreciate your feedback. And
It's been a pleasure, guys. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Absolutely.
wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Okay.